Hello and welcome everybody. We are so happy that you are back with us today. I'm Pamela Lavitt, the Director of Arts and Ideas and Festivals at the Strom Jewish Community Center, and this is our Zoom Interview Thursday show. Zoom Interview is a way for us to zoom in on people who have done, are doing fascinating things in our community. And as a book I recently read by one of our other community members, Lisa Fain, who was interviewed a few weeks ago, it's like an iceberg. There's 20% above the water, 80% underneath. And so I'm really excited today to kind of get underneath the water with our guests. But before we go, I just wanted to remind people that we have some other upcoming programs I definitely want to tell you about. We are dropping our last Bagel Bites episode. We've interviewed 6 of Seattle's new and upcoming and old-time, old-school bagel makers in the city. The last one is an upstart called Mount Bagel, Instagram only, and you got to check them out. The bagels are fantastic. 10:30 a.m. this Sunday. Please check out the interview with Mount Bagel. And then next Tuesday, I'm so excited that we are going to be interviewing Danny Menken. Danny Menken is a filmmaker who has shown about 4 or 5 of his films in the festival. The first one, 39 Pounds of Love, won our Audience Choice Award in 2012, I think, or 2006, actually. Excuse me. It was our first Audience Choice Award. You can watch the film by going to the SJCC.org website, as well as one other of Danny's films. And we're going to join him next Tuesday for Divanathon, our couch conversations with filmmakers, from your couch to mine. And we will talk about Danny Menken's film. But Danny Menken is also the opening night guest for the Seattle Jewish Film Festival and our Real Difference Award winner this year. And so we hope that we'll have some news about screening his latest film, which will premiere the 25th anniversary of the Seattle Jewish Film Festival. So, without further ado, I wanted to just say a few words about our guest today. I'm very excited to have our JCC member, Aaron Kiviat. Aaron is a local criminal defense attorney, but one of the things that you may not know about Aaron, 20 years ago, he spent some time in Egypt as a student, first at Evergreen and then at the University of Washington Jackson School, mapping the cemeteries of Egypt. You might ask, what was an Ashkenazi kid flying off over to Egypt? What did his parents think about that from growing up here in the Seattle region? But it's a fascinating story. And flash forward, hindsight being 2020, there have been recent articles about Egypt's revealing of new reconstructed synagogues, such as the Eliyahu Hanavi in Alexandria. The US Embassy in Cairo has recently talked about the cemeteries that Aaron worked on being restored again. So we're here to flash back 20 years with Aaron, but it's as relevant today as it was 20 years ago. So please welcome my guest, Aaron Kiviat. Welcome.
Thank you, Pamela. Thanks for having me.
So I don't know a whole lot about the Byzantine cemeteries, and I maybe you could just start at the beginning, because not everybody would have spent their senior year in college heading off to Egypt. Can you just sort of take us back, for those of us that don't know your story, and how you were interested in that kind of project?
Sure. Okay. So I can give you a little just background of how I got involved with the Jewish community in Cairo and got involved doing the cemetery project. So I was an Evergreen State College student. That's where I graduated from. But my junior year, I did a program where they send a small amount of students get chosen to study at the Jackson School if they're interested in international studies. So I spent 2 years at the Jackson School. The first year, I studied there on campus at the UW, and the second year I did a study abroad at the American University in Cairo. So my senior year, I studied abroad at the American University in Cairo, and the way I got involved in the Jewish community is it's classic Jewish geography, really. I had a friend named Jenny Shoulder, who I knew from other friends in high school and early college, and she grew up next to or friendly with, at the time, the United States ambassador to Egypt, Daniel Kurtzer. And so she had given me the email address for Sheila Kurtzer, his wife. And so when I got to Cairo, I contacted Sheila, and she was amazing. And the first thing she said was, come for Shabbat dinner at the embassy, which was amazing. I mean, it was probably the most amazing Shabbat dinner I've ever had. And sitting next to me at that dinner was a woman named Carmen Weinstein, who was the president of the Jewish community in Cairo at the time. So this is 1999. And in that dinner, during that Shabbat dinner, Carmen and I spoke a bunch. Yeah, that's me with hair. Muy guapo. I look like a baby. And I think I was 21 or 22 then. And so Carmen and I just started talking, and she needed a lot of help at that time. It was very disorganized. She had a computer. She had no idea how to use it. People had been sending her emails. At that point, email was kind of becoming a thing. And she was getting emails from all over the world. She had no idea how to check her email. She didn't know how to use a mouse. So she asked me to come down and start, helping her do things around the office. And that relationship kind of, grew over that year that I was studying at the AUC, the American University of Cairo. And by the end of that year, we had really built a relationship, and we did a couple really cool projects, cleaning up some synagogues with me gathering students from the AUC. And Carmen and I decided that, I didn't really have a plan of what I was going to do after college, and they needed a lot of help. So we decided that the one thing that needed to be done more than anything was to create a map of the Bassettine Cemetery, because most of the inquiries she was getting from around the world was about inquiring into the graves of ancestors. Is my ancestors, is my mother's grave, my grandparents' grave still there? Is it intact? Can we visit it? And so there was a real need to figure that out. There'd never been a map made. There was no document of where graves were, which is really interesting because the Egyptian community there was very organized. There was a very organized system of births, deaths, brisses, bar mitzvahs, weddings. All that was documented very clearly in their records going back hundreds and hundreds of years. But there was no map of the cemetery. So she said, this is what we need to do. This is the top priority. And so we came up with an idea. I returned back to Seattle after that year, my senior year at AUC, and I started a nonprofit organization, a 501c3 called Friends of the Jewish Community in Cairo. And we raised some money, from some families here in Seattle. Really, those were the donors to send me and a couple other students back to Egypt to document the cemetery. And I returned the next fall, and we started working. I brought the students over. We rented an apartment, and we spent. I was there for almost another year, but the students were there for over time, different periods, about 2 months. Documenting the cemetery. So what we ended up with in the end was a map of the cemetery, and we broke it up into sections, and we documented each grave we could find. Okay, so that is kind of where was the goal. And right, that's the map of the cemetery we ended up with. And this was before Google Earth, so we really didn't even know what the cemetery looked like. Okay, the size or the walls, the layout. So all we had was a 100-meter tape, so like a really long tape measure, and a compass. And so we built this map just using a tape measure, really, and a compass. But what's amazing is now, looking at Google Earth, if you actually look at a satellite image, it's pretty accurate of the shape of what the cemetery was. So we really didn't have a lot of templates to work off of on how to do this. So we kind of just made stuff up as we went. But in the end, I think it's a usable map, and people can find the grave of their loved ones now.
So one of the things I think you might be skipping over for a moment is that you were a student of Middle Eastern studies studying Arabic, and that itself you already had some ability to obviously translate your knowledge and step into the Middle East. But can you talk a little bit about your emotional journey in taking this project on?
I mean, it was definitely, it was an emotional journey. I was 22, so I didn't really know what I was doing. From a conservation standpoint, a business standpoint, a traveling standpoint. So kind of we're winging it. I had a lot of help from people, like my friends, like that's a buddy of mine, Damon Harris, who's still, my closest friend. There were students there that helped me do stuff. And there were families back here in Seattle that helped, support what we were doing. And for instance, one of the students that came with me when I went back to Egypt was Jack Rosen, and he did a great job, came and lived with me there. And his family they were big supporters of the project. So that was, we got support from all over. So yeah, it was great. I mean, maybe I should
in terms of the,
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I was going to say a little bit about the cemetery, and maybe I can show some
Yes,
pictures
please do.
of the cemetery that we're talking about. So it's called the Bassettine Cemetery, and it goes back to the 9th century. So we're talking, 1,200 years old. And so here's a picture. In Egypt, the graveyards look a little different than they do here in America or in other places in Europe. One is, you might have heard, I'm sure everyone's heard, Egyptians, they're kind of obsessed with the afterlife in general, pyramids, tombs, all this stuff. And outside of the city of Cairo, there's this, what's called a necropolis, all right? And that is a city of the dead. And for thousands of years, Egyptians, Cairenes, have been burying their dead on the outskirts of the town. And as time went on, that cemetery grew and grew. We're talking hundreds of thousands, millions of graves over thousands of years. And in the 9th century, the Caliph at the time designated a section of that, donated it to, or gave it to the Jewish population of Egypt. And that is what Bassettine Cemetery is. Half of it was a Talmudic Jewish cemetery, what we would, I guess, call normal Jews, Talmudic Jews, and the other half was Karaite Jews. For Egyptian history, there was a huge Karaite community in Egypt. The Karaite cemetery is mostly gone. It's been built over. If you look in the background of this picture here that I'm showing, can you see this picture? Is that showing up?
Yes.
Behind the graves, you'll see there's what looks like apartment buildings. And these have all been built on top of cemeteries, really, because all this land was cemeteries. But as the population of Cairo grew, the reality was that people the city grew and grew into the necropolis, into the city of the dead. So now you have all these, really tenement squatters living on top of what were cemeteries. But in the 80s, Carmen Weinstein, who was the president of the Jewish community, was able to build a wall, raised money from Egyptian Jews all over the world to build a wall around what we call the Bassettine Cemetery now. And that is about probably 40,000 grave markers like this, these above ground grave markers. And so by the time I got there in the 90s, we were able to, so the late 90s, 99, there were 40,000 of these tombs, of these stone markers, but very few of them had actual marble markings on the top of them. So out of the 40,000, we found maybe 4,000 of them had the marble still on it, and only about half of those, about 2,000, were legible at all. So had some type of information that you could, actually use. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Aaron, I was going to actually share with folks some of the images that you sent me for a moment with some of the images, and especially because obviously they have names of folks that live in our current community, Sephardic, Mizrahi. And so I think in just a moment, I'll go ahead and share those images. It's on a website you sent me, but keep going about the experience of seeing 40,000 graves. How many Jews were living in Egypt at that time that were part of this project, in the diaspora, in Israel, wherever? What was the connection to the community?
So, I mean, that you have to step back a little bit and say, at the peak of the Egyptian Jewish community, there were upwards of 150,000 Jews living in Egypt. So it was a big community, and it was a really very influential community. Jews were involved in, the government and in banking and the development of the railroads and all sectors of the economy. They were wealthy and they were, well connected. By the time I was there, there were probably 20 Jews left. And I'll share a picture of, I think I have a picture here of the day I left, or when I was leaving Egypt. Let me just find this picture.
So while you're looking for this, I did want to share that somebody on the call, Deborah Pardo Kaplan, made a comment. She said, that was an amazing map. My father and his family are Jews from Cairo, and my great-grandfather's probably buried at that cemetery. How can I access that map and the database of names?
Sure. So there's a couple different ways. One, you can just email me and I'll send you the map and the database. It's at the Beit Hatfutzot. So in Egypt, in Israel, the Diaspora Museum, I understand, has a copy of it. I provided it to the AJC recently. So here's one thing so when I made the map, there was very complicated politics, okay? And I should probably give a bit of a background on this power struggle between Egypt and Jews who remained in Egypt and the Jews of Egyptian descent in the diaspora. And there's been this ongoing struggle by Jews in the diaspora to be able to take their heritage out of Egypt. Because the reality is the Jewish community in Egypt is almost gone. And so there's been this movement over the last 40 years to remove the documents, all the, records, and all the Torahs from all the synagogues, all these amazing cultural artifacts. But in Egypt, they see that as, well, those are Egyptian heritage. That's, historical importance to Egypt in the same way, a sarcophagus or a statue of, a pharaoh is. It's part of their history, and they don't want to let it go. So there's been this, this struggle. When we made the map and we made the document, we made the list of names. My agreement with Carmen Weinstein was that it would stay with her. I would not disseminate it until she was gone. And once she was gone, once she passed away, it became clear that that needed to get out there. And so I shared it with several genealogical foundations, as well as Beit Hatfutzot and the AJC. And so that the map is now, disseminated pretty widely. But the answer is email me. I'm happy to get you a copy of the names and the map and help you, decipher it. I'm happy.
Awesome. So show us a little bit more about, you have incredible photos from this time, which I would love to share with people, but maybe you could just talk a little bit as well about, Carmen Weinstein sounds like she was an incredibly influential person in your experience there. You've had a 20-year relationship. What was so significant about her passion for doing this, and what drove her to ensure that these cemeteries were mapped?
She was a controversial woman. I mean, when you talk to people in the diaspora, they would have a different view of her than maybe I had. But my view of her was amazing. She was a woman a Jewish woman in the Middle East running, a Jewish community. She also had a family, a 80-year-old family business, a printing business that she ran every day. She was a character, and excuse my French, she was no bullshit. She was a powerful woman, and she was amazing. She was, but she was also, she ruled with an iron fist. It was she had her minions, and they were, they were in fear and awe of her at all times. But she was able to do things that I think, she walked a very fine line. But she was able to do things, and she was really able to, I think, carry the Jewish community and the properties and the artifacts through a very difficult time. Now things, I think, are coming through the other end of the tunnel, and there's some amazing things happening now in Egypt with the Jewish artifacts. When we can talk about this year, there was the opening of the Eliyahu Hanavi Synagogue, which is, in my honest opinion, the most beautiful synagogue in the world. And I've seen a lot of synagogues. It is amazing. and that was renovated. And the current president, al-Sisi, he's really dedicated to protecting Jewish heritage in Egypt, and has earmarked, I think, somewhere up of $70 million in funds to redo and to safeguard Jewish heritage in Egypt. And in the Bastine Cemetery, it's amazing what has happened in the last year. The Drop of Milk Foundation, with the government and with the U.S. Embassy in Cairo, have all been working together to really make, great progress in cleaning up the cemetery. Yeah, so it's come a long way. I can show some pictures of what the cemetery was like when I was there. It was full of garbage, because it was surrounded by tenements. So the reality is here's a picture right here of what the cemetery looked like when I was there. Okay, so these are old graves, really old graves, no markers, but the community around it had been throwing garbage over the walls for years and years. So there was, acres of trash. And my understanding from the head of the Drop of Milk Foundation recently is that they cleared away 1,600 square meters of garbage over the last year. And I can show I'm going to show a couple other pictures here.
So while you're showing this, it's such a contrast to some of the articles that just were published right before the COVID moment in February, with huge reinvestment in the restoration of this. So what has changed?
Okay, so politically, that's really interesting. Okay, so why would the president of Egypt find it important to do this show of goodwill? That's probably a question for a political scientist. I think, obviously, it shows goodwill to Israel, and it shows goodwill to the United States. It shows, religious pluralism, and, I think it's, I'm sure there are political reasons why al-Sisi is doing this. I'm not sure he's a great lover of the Jewish people. He may be, I don't know, but it is pretty fantastic. If you look at this picture right here, what you're seeing is this is a corner of the cemetery where construction rubble, just bricks, had been tossed over there for decades and decades. And I'm going to show another picture of what it looks like since they've cleaned it up. It's really amazing the progress they're making since I was there. Let me show you a picture of what that looks like now. Yeah, so all that rubble, they just cleared it all away. So it's been completely removed. And so, that's awesome. I can't tell you how. So here's another picture of what the cemetery looks like. I can flip through a couple pictures. And there's a picture of the map. And this is a picture of a funeral I attended when I was there from a gentleman named Robert Nachman. And I went to a couple funerals. What's really interesting is this is still a cemetery that is still used to this day. That even though there's very few Jews left, when they die, they're still buried there. And I've heard, and I don't know the historical accuracy of it, but I did hear that it is the second oldest Jewish cemetery of continuous use in the world, and the first being the Mount of Olives. So outside of the old city of Jerusalem, after that, this is the oldest continually used Jewish cemetery in the world. So
since you're talking about a Jewish burial moment here, I'm curious to know, you had shared a story, like a blog, about your own experience being called to stand graveside, and you had to leave something of yourself there. So can you tell that story?
Sure, I'll tell a story. I'll tell it kind of quickly, but really one reason why I think I really feel a deep spiritual bond to that earth, to that piece of land, to that cemetery. So one day I was there. I was still a student at the American University of Cairo, and I got a call. It was in the morning, and it was Carmen Weinstein, and she says, "I'm sending a car to pick you up." And I was like, "Okay, I have school today," but she's like, "Well, it's very important. I'm sending a driver to come pick you up and take you out to the cemetery. I need you there." This wasn't this picture though. This was a different time. She says, "I need you there for a funeral. One of the men have died." When I was there was probably 4 or 5 men still left in Cairo. And I think I met all of them. Anyways, she had told me Jacques Moseries had died. And he was an old man. I had met him in the hospital. I think he'd been pretty ill. She says, okay. I was like, great. So I figured she needed me for a minion. So I had brought my tallis with me and, my whatever. So I grabbed it and I had a siddur. And, I went to Herzl. I'm not a rabbi. I didn't know a lot about anything. But, she's like, I'm sending in the car to get you. And they drove me out to the City of the Dead. And once we got to the Bastille Cemetery, we opened up, the gates opened up and the car parked and I went in and, out in the distance, like if you see this here, the grave way out in the distance there, I saw, there were about 4 people standing around a grave and 3 of them were grave diggers and one of them was Carmen. And I went out and she says, I was like, okay, what's going on? He's like, well, this Mr. Moseries died last night and we're burying him now. And I said, okay, where's everybody else? She's like, well, this is everybody. I was like, okay. And then she says, okay, pray. She tells me, just go ahead and pray. I was like, I have no idea what to do. I know, Kaddish. So I put my tallis on and, I had my siddur and I read Kaddish. And when I looked up after reading Kaddish, I looked around and you can't really see here, but the walls of the cemetery, when I looked up, there were hundreds of people looking over the walls because they hadn't seen anyone buried for a very long time. Probably, I don't know, years the last person had been buried. There was all these people just staring at me wearing a tallis and saying Kaddish. And so right afterwards, after I say Kaddish, she says to me, well, I didn't bring a tallis for him, and he's supposed to be wearing a tallis. Give him yours. And this was the tallis my dad had given me for my bar mitzvah. And so I did. So we wrapped it around him, and they buried him. The grave diggers buried him. And so my tallis is buried in the Bastille Cemetery with a man named Jacques Moseries. And so I always feel, I'll always feel a kinship to that cemetery. I feel like a part of me is buried there.
Are there any other images that you want to share with us? And then we do have some questions that are coming in and I'd love to ask them. But I'm also kind of curious, some of the questions, the tenor of them is about sort of the politics of the time and political controversies, whether it was, Carmen herself, was there anybody, it says somebody might know a little more than I do here. Was it really her ruling with an iron fist or her mother, Esther Weinstein, or perhaps the Mukhabarat controlling her? There were questions.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, all I know is, there were Egyptian high-ranking officials that would come by and check on us at the cemetery weekly, just to look over and just make sure we weren't, really, I think, to make sure we weren't in any danger. And there was always an armed Egyptian guard. They sent an armed, police, guard out front all the time. They definitely did not want to see anything bad happen to us. Mm-hmm. And, every time I was at, Carmen's shop, there were very important Egyptians in very important looking uniforms stopping in to talk to her at all times. So she was highly connected with the top echelons of what was going on in Cairo. Carmen was ruling it though. I mean, Esther was the most wonderful old lady, but she was not in charge. She was a figurehead for a long time. I know she was the president, but it was Carmen that was in charge until the day.
There's a little follow-up to that, which is something about birth and marriage certificates that Carmen may or may not have ever kind of shared photocopies of that. Was there a reason why she kept those or didn't share them freely?
Yeah, I mean, I could tell you, I saw them all. There were, huge, these amazing bound books, they're like, 4 foot by 2 feet and written in this most beautiful Ladino script and that Judeo-Arabic, beautiful, and in Italian and French on all pages that had birth dates and marriage dates and death dates. And there were tomes and tomes of, volumes and volumes of these at the Jewish Community Center. And I looked through them, and one of the projects we had thought about doing at one point was digitizing those, but it would have been such an amazing project. But why did Carmen not release those? I don't know. I have some ideas. She never told me, but you know, the way I see it, a couple things. I think the Egyptian government thought that, or still maybe thinks that it's their intellectual property. It's their property, and you know that could be it. Okay, it could also have been that Carmen thought it was potentially a way that the Jewish community of Cairo could have made a made money from it at some point in time by keeping it in their hands and doling out the information upon request. It's possible. I don't know, but all I know is those documents I'm sure are still there. I don't know if they've ever been released or documented. I know it's important to a lot of Egyptian people with Egyptian ancestry, because those are, I mean, they're amazing documents. They were very detailed documents.
So that was from Joseph Mosseri, who said he has no relationship to Jacques, who you mentioned in the burial ground. But continue to share these, and I will. You can describe your slides, but there are some really great questions from people who clearly feel a very strong investment in the conversation about their Egyptian families and also the time. So, can you tell us what we're looking at here?
So this is just a photo of the Bastine Cemetery, just to give you an idea of what it looks like. In the back, you see actually a large, what looks like a large stone building. And so some of the wealthier families built tombs. So I think that was the Bondi tomb. I'm not positive in the background. I'd have to look at my map to see exactly what it was. But there were some families that were very wealthy, like the Katawis, some Moseris, and then there were some very famous rabbis like Chaim Capucci, who, I mean, you may not know that name, but especially Sephardim really know that name. And in Israel, he's very well known. I think he was a miracle worker. He was known to be, a very important rabbi. His tomb is right behind there. And, so the richer families and the important families had these giant tombs. So that's what you're looking at here. I can go to the next one. I think we saw that shot, but this is, these are wild dogs living in the cemetery. After we did our project, Carmen planted these beautiful flowers, put in an irrigation system. It's just an example of what kind of got cleaned up after we were there. I think I showed this picture of the rubble and garbage. Here's a picture of Jack Rosen and Anthony. These were two of my volunteers cleaning a cemetery, and so cleaning a grave. And this is kind of what we did. We went from gravestone to gravestone. We cleaned it off. We documented the information on it. We marked it with a number. So if you look at my map, there was a grid, and then we would go across in a line. So it would be like, the A section, A1, 2, 3, and on and on. And you actually look where between his legs, you kind of see there's a circular object here. That's the meters tape I was talking about, the 100-meter tape that we used to do all of our documenting. That was really the most advanced tool we had. This picture is actually from the Crayim Synagogue. I organized the first year I was there a group of American University in Cairo students to clean up the synagogue, and this was the stairwell going up to the women's section. And so people have been throwing garbage into the synagogue for 60 years, and it was pretty amazing. In this stairwell, I actually found a couple things in the stairwell. One, I think this is a cantor's hat, which is it was a hat that clergy must have worn in that shul, and I would put it on, but it's really falling apart, and also I have no idea what's living in it. But one other thing I found in that stairwell, which is crazy, and I probably wasn't supposed to take this stuff with me, but it was buried in so much garbage. I found a bag of tefillin.
Aaron, will you stop your screenshot for a moment so we can see that bag a little bit more up closely?
Yeah, okay, stop screenshot. Okay, so I found this bag buried under that garbage. And inside the bag are maybe 20 pairs of the most beautiful little tefillin. And, I took them with me. And I probably wasn't supposed to do that. I'd probably get into a lot of trouble these days. But it's in this, like, it looks like a pillowcase sewn up. And, it was like they left in a hurry. There were umbrellas still on the coat rack. And, it was, in the synagogues, it was crazy. A couple other things we found that day, I was able to take with me the day we cleaned up the Kraim synagogue, was I found some letterhead from the Kraim synagogue. It says the Pachad Yitzhak temple. That was the official name, but everyone called it the Kraim synagogue in Sakakini. And I found this in just a pile of garbage, and I thought, this is amazing. I'll keep that with me. And there were also prayer books just in the garbage. And so I was able to take a couple of them with me. But what's amazing is there's wormholes or bug holes throughout all of them. So these are things that would end up in a geniza, obviously.
You were in the right place for that.
Right, and that's another whole story with the Egyptian history. But so it was a pretty amazing day. I can show a couple pictures from that day of cleaning up that synagogue.
I'm going to get to some of the questions that people have.
Okay, yeah, let's do that. Yeah.
And please, I think you should screen share. There's a lot of images, and I have a few to share at the end, which is the reconstructed Bazatin and what they look like. But, the late 90s, there was, interesting times in the Middle East. You had the Second Intifada, Matt mentions. So, how was your work supported by the government at that time? Many of us know that Jews of Egypt that went to Israel, there was a lot of resentment because of what happened in the Suez Canal. So what was the relationship at that time between Jews to Israel and to the Egyptians?
I mean, there was still, the peace process was still kind of, hopeful. So, I think there was still hope at the time. Egyptians are, they're people, right? And the vast majority of Egyptians had never met a Jew. So older Egyptians, you talk to them and they're, oh yeah, our neighborhood was full of Jews. Like, I went to school, there were Jews there. But anyone under, 60 had never met a Jew. And, when you meet someone, they're generally blown away that you're not an evil person. And, so I was able to really, I think, create a lot of good relationships. That being said, I cause a lot of anxiety. I think now it'd be much harder for me to do that. I think, when you're 22, you don't consider the danger of anything. But I don't think I was ever in any danger or anything like that. That being said, we had a lot of people looking out for us. Like I said, Carmen had organized the Egyptian security would look out for us. And the Israeli embassy had people come by and look at us weekly and check in on us, make sure we were, safe. And they offered us a lot of support. And the wife of the Israeli ambassador at the time, Michelle Mazel, she was very supportive and involved, and she wanted to see us succeed. And so did Sheila Kurtzer. So we had support from people who were very helpful.
Just a little side note, but Daniel Kurtzer is the father of a really good friend of mine and was one of our guests at the JCC to talk about his Pulitzer Prize winning book a couple of years ago. John Kurtzer, his brother, is a KXP founder. So I don't know if you know about those roots in Seattle, cool. But we'll have to.
Well, David, so their other brother, David Kurtzer, was there in Egypt with us and married a really wonderful woman named Lucy Ellenbogen, who was in my class at AUC and was also involved in some of the stuff we did. So, yeah.
Yeah. So take us out on a little bit of a tour of some of these images. And as I said, it's 2020 and this is 20 years ago, but how much are you still connected? And these current rededications, I just showed some images of 200 families from Egypt returning to the Eliyahu Hanavi synagogue and to the Basatin cemetery. What's been your emotional journey through these 20 years and the connections?
Well, honestly, I have not been involved much at all, but the reason why this kind of came up was because a gentleman by the name of Sami Ibrahim contacted me recently and said, kind of out of the blue, and he's the head of the Drop of Milk Foundation, which is an organization in Cairo that is dedicated to the preservation of of Jewish heritage and Jewish heritage sites in Cairo. And he's been awesome. And he wrote me and said, Aaron, I just want to let you know that we're making a marble plaque in your honor and putting it up at Basseterre. And so this, can you see this? Is this showing now?
Oh, yeah.
And so this was put up in Basseterre last month. And so I kind of, Amy Lavitt saw this and said, that's really interesting. What's this story? And so that's kind of how we ended up here. That's why this has kind of come back around. And so,
well, while we're looking at this and enjoying this, let me get to some of these questions here because they're amazing. So one is, were you ever approached, this is from Amal Shafek, were you ever approached for a documentary film interview about your experience?
I haven't, no.
Amal, you want to make a movie? And so Joseph also mentioned, this is Maseri, that his dad actually knew Mr. Zaki Kraim, the founder of the Bahad. Okay, I'm going to have a hard time with
Bahad Yitzhak, yeah, which means like the fear Isaac's fear or something, I think. That's really cool. I would love to know the history of that synagogue because it's not documented anywhere.
Fascinating. So we have one other, thanking you so much for a great presentation. Do you know anything about the grave of Rabbi Chaim Nahum, whether you know anything about that at the cemetery?
I mean, I saw it. I don't know much about it. My understanding is they're cleaning that up as well, I think, but I don't know specifics on that.
Can you tell us all who he is? I'm not familiar with.
I don't know too much about him.
Got it. So I just wanted to say if there's any other images that you'd like to show us, and I wanted to let people know that on our JCC website right now, you can go and underneath the mention of this and Aaron's presentation today, there are a number of links. You can see the cemetery mapping, and obviously you can email me, Pamela L at SJCC.org, to hook you up with some of these amazing treasure trove of information that folks seem to really want to know where their parents are buried and families buried. Oh, I've got one more. Any pictures of the Eliyahu Hanavi Synagogue in Alexandria? I can share one at the end unless you have one, which is that beautiful one.
I do have some, but I think I just downloaded them from the internet. So, nothing of my own, but it is the most beautiful synagogue I have ever seen. What I found amazing about it was the whole hall. If you have a picture of, do you have a picture of it?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and pull that up. So just give me just a moment. Go ahead.
The inside, if you have a picture of the inside, the whole inside is lined with this rose marble that was imported from Italy, I think, in like the late 1800s. It is the most beautiful synagogue. If there's any way to get, that you can visit it, it is so cool. I mean, it's nothing like it.
This is what we're looking at right now, correct?
That's the outside of it, which I think it's interesting that there's two Coptic priests in front, but that's generally, let's see if I can find.
I have one other if you don't want to share. I think this is, if I'm correct, give me 1 second and then you can take it from here.
I think I have any photos here.
Yeah, take a look at this one. I think that's it as well.
Yes, that is it. So you see these pillars, these like rows, these beautiful pink marble pillars. It's amazing. I mean, and it's the way you walk into like cathedrals in Europe and you get that, they built synagogues like that in Cairo, in Egypt. That was in Alexandria, but they really built amazing synagogues there. They were really beautiful.
We've got our last couple of questions from Denise. Is there anything left from the Karaite cemetery, and did you ever go to Al-Basia Synagogue?
Where's the Al-Basia Synagogue? I can't read. Can she answer me?
Yeah, Denise, would you mind?
Is that the Karaite? Is that the Karaite synagogue in Cairo? Because if it is, I did go there. I did visit the Karaite synagogue, and that was crazy. It was so cool. I went one day with Carmen, and I know recently they found some like ancient codex just sitting on a shelf there last year that I guess was, it had been overlooked, but it was immensely historically important, which is crazy because I probably I was looking at those shelves and probably saw it, which is amazing. But is that the synagogue she's talking about?
She hasn't responded yet, but I'm sure that will connect you guys. So I have one last thought or one last question for you. So as you experience your Passover Seder every year with your family, and you talk about Mitzrayim, what is the thing that you're thinking about Egypt, as the rest of us maybe should incorporate into our own thinking about Egypt as well?
Well, I mean, I guess one thing I think about is, one thing I think about all the time is, the community there was deep. It had deep roots, deep culture. It had been there for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it was diverse. It had Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardic Jews, Mizrahi Jews, and it was involved in every aspect of the community. I'm not talking about ancient Egypt. I'm talking about the modern Egyptian community, and it was gone overnight. Political situation happened, and within a decade, what was a thriving, huge community was gone. And I think about that all the time when you think about what could happen in different, in different situations, how, things can just disappear overnight. So, it I think sheds light on realities of what can be. But one thing Carmen told me when I left, one of the last things she told me, she looked at me, she grabbed me, and she told me, "Aaron, you and your family, your wife and kids," I wasn't married at the time, "your wife and kids will move back to Egypt and be the first Egyptian the first new Jewish Egyptian family to start a community." She really wanted me to. I haven't been able to talk my wife into it yet.
Well, we say as Jews that, Torah can be a place or it can be something in our hearts. And I guess that's where Egypt just has to reside for you right now. But thank you so much for spending time with us, Aaron Kiviat, and sharing your stories. And I just think because of the current dedications of the synagogue and the Basatine Cemetery, this is more relevant than ever. And thank you all, everybody, for joining us for the Zoom interview. Join us again next week. And we have some great upcoming shows, so please check it out at sjcc.org or like us on Facebook at Seattle JFF. Thank you so much, Aaron, for being our guest today. Take care.
My pleasure. And is my email available to anybody? I'm sorry I didn't get to all the questions. I'm seeing now that there were a lot of questions. People can email me with any questions about this. I'm happy to respond.
All right. And you have to go to Aaron Kiviat, criminal defense attorney, and you'll find your email there.
Cool. All right. Thank you so much.
Right on, everybody. Take care. Be safe, everyone. Great for joining us. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Pamela.
Thank you.